So what's it been like since the release of Plandemic Part 1?
It's been an unbelievable few weeks. A lot of it very painful, a lot of it somewhat cathartic and relief that the truth's finally getting out there.
Yeah, I certainly am there with you, to have half the world jump out and to make these really unfounded and in some cases crazy accusations about the both of us. And so my intention here today to call you back into this dialogue is to really set the record straight, to refute some of the debunkers out there, to clarify some of the questions that the people have, above all, to really clarify your intentions and my intentions. Because I think that it's really easy for people to assume the worst right away, especially when they hear something that sounds unbelievable. And the challenge that we're all facing out there right now is that what's being revealed is unbelievable. Let's start with the controversy around the claim that your work in some way revolutionized HIV/AIDS.
The hypothesis that my thesis proved and answered
because
was
I think that it's really easy for people to assume the worst right away, especially when they hear something that sounds unbelievable.
Another infected
and the challenge that we're all
cell
facing out there
that
right
was
now
driving
is
the
that
pathogenesis.
what's being revealed
and my thesis
is
proposed that was the monocyte macrophage. The other was that the virus was dormant in the macrophage and would activate with immune activation. It's a transcription factor, so it has to be in the nucleus. So we isolated the nuclei of cells and showed, in fact, that NF-kappa B was there and the inflammatory cytokines were being produced. So finally, I did a number of mechanisms, including DNA methylation. So I talk about epigenetic strategies, and that was really, again, a paradigm-shifting work, which we continued to understand it after my PhD and my postdoctoral studies. And that took 4 years. That paper took 4 years to publish because it was unheard of that retroviruses actually manipulated the DNA methylation machinery at the enzymatic level, at the very enzymes that methylate in order to keep themselves active and expressed. So at the time I defended my thesis on November 14, 1991, basically the only question I was asked was by a committee of experts in monocyte macrophages, based on your thesis, will Magic Johnson die of AIDS? And I said, well, he wouldn't die of AIDS, but of course he has to change everything. He has to take the antiretroviral therapy that had been developed in the last few years. It was called highly active antiretroviral therapies, combination of drugs. At the time, we were told those were very dangerous and you wanted to wait till the very last moment in order to treat. But my thesis said you needed to prevent the reservoirs from expanding. You need to keep the virus latent in the monocyte macrophage, and that was driving the disease. The monocyte macrophage deletion in CCR5 delta 32, those people would never get AIDS despite how high the circulation of virus was. So all of these things changed the paradigm. So to this day, he's never developed AIDS. He keeps immune suppressed with steroids. We never vaccinated an AIDS patient with anything because that's immune activation. Very important in today's world. So yes, it did change paradigms. It's not it's a body of work, and that's what a PhD thesis is.
What do you have to say to the people who have tried to minimize your involvement with HIV by stating that you were at the bottom of the totem pole, 13th author of a 13-member group of scientists?
Well, the 13th author is the senior author. So what people don't appreciate is the first author is usually the student, usually the postdoc, and they do the bulk of the work, but it is a senior author that is responsible, for every aspect of the study, every aspect of the collaborators. So it's not really appreciated that the last is actually first.
Why did you agree to retract your own XMRV paper?
I did not retract the XMRV science paper. The paper was actually forced retract. I was actually being held in jail when it was retracted. I did, however, agree in June of 2011 to a partial retraction, and all the authors agreed to a partial retraction because the problem was the difference between a natural isolate and a synthetic clone. This was the first time a disease-causing human retrovirus family was synthesized before it was isolated, and that created all the conflict. So the partial retraction, when it was clear VP62 never was the viruses or the strain we identified, we agreed to the partial retraction from science, as did all of the authors on the paper who had made that mistake of the contamination of the natural isolates with the synthetic molecular clone.
According to some of the debunkers out there, there have been multiple other laboratories and studies, including your own lab, that failed to replicate your XMRV paper and work in general. Is that not true?
Our work was absolutely replicated. In fact, within a month of its description, I attended a meeting held by the Silverman Lab at the Cleveland Clinic, and an investigator known as Gary Owens from the University of Virginia had come and presented a paper where he identified what he called then XMRV2. So it was a more distantly related strain, and it was found in different people, not people with ME/CFS, in fact, people with cardiac disease. He was a cardiologist at Virginia. So he was yelled at during the meeting by John Coffin and said, "You can't call that XMRV2. You know nothing about, sequences and phylogeny. That's what they call xenotropic versus polytropic." But the viruses were never named based on that. They were named, DeRisi and Silverman named the virus xenotropic because it was found in a human and not a mouse. Xeno means foreign. And then they called it MLV. The M in XMRV stands for murine leukemia virus, related retrovirus, RV, so XMRV. So Gary Owens, a month later, had confirmed our work by isolating or identifying another family member. Our paper said this paper identifies for the first time, the first direct isolation of a new family of infectious transmissible gamma retroviruses, and that was replicated by multiple people, and to this day stands true.
One of the hundreds of doctors that I've spoken with since the release of Plandemic Part 1, I had a very interesting conversation with this particular doctor, very well-known person. I said, "Have you seen Plandemic Part 1? And is there anything, be honest, that you disagree with?" Yeah, I can say that I disagree with her comment that none of the scheduled RNA vaccines work. And I said, "Okay, well, which ones work?" And he said, "Well, let's define work." And he said, because some of them, we can't argue with the fact that they do what they were intended to do. They minimize the disease that they're fighting. It's the collateral damage that makes it questionable. And I said, so in essence, if I have a broken toe, I cut off my foot, I've taken care of the broken toe. He said, in some cases, yeah. In a lot of cases, yes. But it's the long-term effects, it's the allergies, it's the other opportunistic viruses that then are empowered by the breaking down of our immune systems. And those are the conversations that we need to have.
Correct. And that's what our work's all about. So I actually, when I thought about that statement, that people call me an anti-vaxxer. And I'm not an anti-vaxxer because I've spent my entire life on the simple hypothesis that we can educate the immune system to prevent and treat chronic and infectious disease. Cancer and AIDS. That was my PhD thesis. That was everything I did in industry and everything I did at universities and at the National Cancer Institute for 22 years. Always that single thought. That's the definition of a vaccine. But I said I wouldn't. I'm called an anti-vaxxer, and there is one vaccine I would take today should I need it, and that's the rabies vaccine. So that's an RNA vaccine that actually works. And I would take that vaccine because you take it after the exposure, and the disease is worse than the collateral damage we just discussed of the vaccine.
So there's some confusion online because you have a lot of statements that you've made in different interviews where you tell part of the narrative that suggests that you were taken out of your home, and then another part of the story that says you surrendered, you turned yourself in. And so people are using those to say, look how she's contradicted herself. I don't think people realize that there are actually three different stories that are being addressed here. So the first story is they came to your house, and you went out the back door onto your boat where you would be safe in international waters until you could figure out what they were doing. The second time they came to your house, surrounded your house, boats in the harbor, police all around, came into your house, took you away, and terrorized your husband. The third time, you turned yourself in Nevada.
But I never surrendered myself. I was told I had to go there, or I would be arrested again. To this day, I've never had a day in court. My cases have been dismissed by corrupt judges in a corrupt system. They held our case under seal for 5 years. They haven't given me whistleblower protection, and they held that. That was the Ketam case. It's called the whistleblower case. The case was dismissed with prejudice the next Monday, meaning I basically made up the whole thing and done. No rights, no anything ever. I've been denied the ability to work. I can't get grants again. My papers were all treated, my entire career was treated as if it was fraud. They destroyed my reputation, so I lost my ability to work. I lost the ability to pursue my passion. I lost every dime I ever made, and other people are publishing our results with different interpretation, and every one of the perpetrators of the crimes continue to be paid tens of millions of dollars. Ian Lipkin was awarded a $34 million grant right after that study was published by Tony Fauci to set up the Center for Discovery and Diagnostics, and he's been spending it on coronaviruses in the Barrick lab and other lab ever since.
There's some controversy out there stating that your former assistant, Max, signed an affidavit
Correct.
saying that you asked him to steal something from the laboratory.
Correct. That was in that civil
Let
lawsuit.
me just make sure I'm clear on this. Max goes to the lab, and he discovers that drawers had been pried open and broken open, and that it appeared that there had been some kind of a robbery.
Max really saved the day. I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you today without Max that night. He goes in there, he takes a picture of it with his cell phone of the robbery in place, and he said, "What do I do?" And I said, "Max, you must secure. That's human data. It's IRB protected. The sequences are, this belongs to the taxpayers." And I said, "You must secure the data." And he said, "I can't get in my office. I can't get in the lab. What do I do with it?" And I said, "I don't care. Take it home. Secure it." So he takes it home, he secures it, and the Whittemores write their civil lawsuit that has Harvey Whittemore in an affidavit saying, "Oh, we went in the next day and nobody had the keys but Dr. Mikovits, and we had to call the desk manufacturer and have them come and open the doors, and they were empty." She stole all that stuff. So I have the original affidavits that were filed literally and pulled by the judge, by the corrupt system, by whoever, from the file. They had been filed as complete fraud. They clearly got caught in literally creating, a lawsuit, fabricating this crime, I say Watergate style. And why Tony Fauci and the NIAID were implicated in this crime is because between September 29th and November 18th, when I was arrested, they inspected everything in my lab and said everything was there. And therefore, the embattled institute could keep the grants.
In Pandemic 1, we spoke about the 5-year gag order. Now let's clarify this, because I think that there's some confusion around the lack of evidence that there was an official gag order placed on you, and I think that deserves a little bit of explanation.
The charges were dropped without prejudice, which meant at any time they could come into my house if I ever went on social media, if I did any presentations in science, if I tried to get a job, if I tried to use my grants, if I did anything at all to disparage in any way the Whittemores. Then I would have been arrested again. So what I was told was they would find new evidence and arrest me. And that was September 6th of 2012. And I said, that's ridiculous. There is no new evidence. And my lawyer looked at me coldly and said, there was no evidence the first time, was there? And it's one of the few times I cried. This so-called contract said they owned every thought I ever had before or after leaving the Institute. And of course, I never signed it. Again, my lawyer proved in March that was a forgery. So that was the gag order. So I didn't dare risk going on a computer and talking to anybody other than my family or my lawyers as directed. So all while the Science Insider, the journals were destroying my reputation and actually had me in a press conference where I had to say it simply doesn't exist. The it was VP62. The it wasn't our viruses, but I didn't have the sequences and I couldn't prove anything. So I had to say it wasn't there because I didn't have the samples.
From what I understand, you were forced to author a paper to renounce the idea that the blood supply had been tainted.
Correct.
Tell me about that.
The day our science paper was published, October 8, 2009, we immediately started what we called the blood working group to determine if the blood supply was contaminated, and that's how these viruses had gotten into people, just because that's what we learned with HIV/AIDS. And we did not want that to happen again. We wanted to make sure the blood supply wasn't contaminated. So we started that study on March 29th of 2011. I presented at a meeting of the New York Academy of Sciences that the blood supply was in fact heavily contaminated. It was 1 million Americans had potentially been infected by a contaminated blood supply back then in 1991, and now it's as many as 25 to 50 million Americans. Michael Bush and Simone Glenn called me on the Monday after Labor Day of 2011, the Tuesday, and said to me, if you don't co-author this paper that says there's a failure to confirm an association of CFS and XMRV, then your career's over. The paper that came out November 11th and on September 22nd was a failure to confirm pure fraud. Pure fraud, criminal fraud on the part of Michael Bush and the people who perpetrated it, the authors on that paper.
Is there anything that you would like to clarify regarding your statement that Italy's tragic death toll had something to do with the vaccine in 2019?
That flu vaccine that the elderly, the most susceptible to COVID, contained 4 different strains of influenza, and those strains, including H1N1, a highly pathogenic strain, and all of these strains cause upper respiratory infections, and that particular vaccine was grown in maiden Darby kidney cells. That's a dog kidney cell line. So dogs and all animals have coronaviruses. The Wolf paper of 2020 said that if flu vaccines were given, that there was an increased risk of getting SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19.
I'm glad you brought up this study, because this has been another point of contention, that people have said that the Wolf study proves the exact opposite of what you suggested. Then I hear it from doctors saying, no, absolutely, this was a very substantial study done with the U.S. military, and it proved that you're 30% more likely to contract coronavirus if you've had the seasonal flu shot.
Yeah, so the coronaviruses, not coronavirus. So this is what we're doing again as we twisted our work in the XMRVs that they could only be VP62. They're doing the same thing with SARS-CoV-2. The SARS coronavirus 2, I never said was in that vaccine, but all dogs have coronaviruses. So yes, there's an increased possibility. And in fact, that's one of the reasons I wanted to discuss that issue again, because I'm telling people everywhere, please do not get a flu vaccine at the end of the summer, or we will see another outbreak of COVID-19. The vaccine will drive the pandemic, just as the flu vaccine in Italy drove the excessive number of deaths in Italy. That's one of the most dangerous, untested vaccines I've ever seen.
Let's jump to the claim that you made that evolution from a bat to human can take up to 800 years.
I base that on the fact that in order for a virus to replicate and survive, it has to not kill the cells of its host. So you can't study a virus unless you can grow it. You can't grow the antigen. You can't grow the attenuated virus unless there's a cell line that will support its replication without dying. And that wasn't true in the mid-90s for the Ebola Zaire strain. I found a cell line, Vero monkey E6, that would support Ebola replication, Ebola Zaire, and not kill it. So when you have these immune deficiencies, well, what was distinct about the Vero monkey kidney cells? That again, we grow polio vaccines in those, and we grow SARS-CoV-2. And it has HIV, Vero monkey kidney cells, simian immune deficiency virus, coronaviruses, gamma retroviruses, SV40, monkey retroviruses, all which can be passengers in the product that we have. So the virus was never isolated, and meaning the SARS-CoV-2, and that's why I say it's the passenger viruses causing the disease.
In part one, you made a comment to the effect that Ebola was unable to affect humans until we took it into the lab and taught it.
Yeah.
Were you speaking about you taking it into the lab and teaching it, or we, the scientific community?
Both. Okay. So this is the whole idea of the 800-year evolution. It has to go into another animal that can support its replication with a different immunity than the bat, so that it could be a virus factory. And a cell line is the same as another small animal, and the monkeys were some of those other small animals that Ebola grew in quite happily in Africa and in Zaire. So my job was to teach it, find a cell line. I use the word teach it because one of the ways we do that is to continuously feed human cells in the hopes that one human cell wouldn't die and we could continue to replicate it. And we would grow it with growth factors and we would baby it so the virus wouldn't kill it. So we as the scientific community as well as me, I did that work for at least 3 or 4 years in the biosafety level 4 facility at USAMRIID. And it is significant that that is where the Chinese originally got the cell line. So you cannot say it evolved naturally. Every time you grow a virus, you mutate it, you change it, because the different animal has an immune system that will try to stop its replication, as we discussed.
You made a statement that a generation of Africans were damaged due to some of the policies around HIV/AIDS in the 80s.
When Tony Fauci stopped us, the team I was working on with Dr. Rossetti, from publishing that paper in 1984, Bob Gallo and Tony Fauci fought over, an entire French government and U.S. government fought over who owned the virus, who owned the patent rights to the diagnostic tests. An entire continent got infected. And we spread that virus, and not just Africa, but here in America, because we spared that virus with the hepatitis B vaccine. So we did as we're doing today and said, everybody get the vaccine so you don't get HIV in the high-risk groups. And now we appreciate that vaccines, contaminated vaccines, probably spread, and a contaminated blood supply, the XMRVs, because the CFS patients were always tracking, and they called it CFS because it wasn't gay men IV drug drug users and prostitutes. It was women and children who had gotten those blood transfusions, so they were called non-HIV AIDS.
There are a lot of people in the medical community who see no issues with people in advisory positions owning patents.
I worked in the glory days before you could patent your work, and in the translational institute called the Biological Response Modifiers Program. So countries, universities, people worked with everybody, and we translated very quickly those discoveries into treatments that were life-saving, and that doesn't happen now. That doesn't happen at all now, while everybody has their intellectual property offices to decide who owns what, and you patent, you delay appropriate testing, you delay appropriate therapeutics. It's clear that things like type 1 interferon, hydroxychloroquine, Suramin, the 100-year-old WHO anti-gamma retroviral that could treat effectively in clinical trials, they're not used because they're not patentable. You know, the taxpayers pay for all of the research and all of the drug development and all of the work. To own that, to own, you know, rights to and make money off discoveries that somebody else paid for, the intellectual property belongs to the taxpayers.
I think the problem really is when those people also have the power to steer political policy to make sure that their discovery is the only one that we look at, while other discoveries that might be a lot more cost-effective and a lot more effective get pushed aside. That's where the real problem comes in.
And that's exactly what we're seeing with remdesivir and hydroxychloroquine and the interferons, vitamin D, you know, sunlight, you know, that's what we're seeing in COVID. So simple natural product and nutritional support isn't even discussed ways to enhance the immune system. It's only driven towards, you know, patentable vaccines or patentable new antiviral therapies.
You told me during a pre-interview that you had had financial offers to remain silent.
If you simply say you made a mistake and promise never to say another word, you can keep everything. You'll get all of your grants. You'll get everything back, millions of dollars. You'll get publication and funding. My lawyer said, that's the best offer you're going to get. I said, you don't understand me. I don't need an offer. I've already lost everything. If I thought even one child or one grandma was injured or killed because I didn't do something, that would have ended my life as I know it. There was no money you could ever pay me to get me to cover this up. I will never stop telling the truth.